Well, this morning we are going to be talking about the three wise men. We will be looking at Matthew's record of the three wise men coming to see Jesus. We will be looking at Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, as a record of this incredible visitation by these strange people from the east. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea at the time of King Herod, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is this one who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him." And King Herod heard this, and he was alarmed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, after assembling all the chief priests and the experts in the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they said, "for it is written this way by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are in no way least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Well, then Herod privately summoned the wise men and determined from them when the star had appeared. Then he sent to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and carefully look for the child. When you find him, inform me so that I can go and worship him as well.' Now, after listening to the king, they left, and once again the star they saw when it arose led them until it stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they shouted joyfully. And they came into the house, and they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. And they opened their treasure boxes and gave him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. But after being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back by another route to their own country." Well, we have been looking at this time of the year, we have been looking at different parts of the story of how Jesus came to earth. And we have seen recently from Luke chapters 1 and 2, the first witnesses to this important event of all of human history, of the very Son of God, the very God incarnate coming to us. And if you might remember from last week, there were a series of witnesses that were bearing testimony to this baby that Mary was going to have was very different. And if you remember from last week, it went from being very private to being very public. The witnesses started out with, from what we can see, just Mary and Elizabeth. It's hard for us to imagine how Mary would have traveled nearly 100 miles by herself. It wasn't a very safe route, but there's nobody else mentioned. And Elizabeth, when she has Mary enter the house, she gives that very specific prophecy about this baby that Mary has. But again, it was apparently just Mary and Elizabeth. Much like a few days or weeks earlier, it was just Mary and the angel, very private. But then, as the baby is born and they take the baby to the temple, the next witness is this strange, righteous man, Simeon, who had been apparently visited by an angel or the Spirit and was told that he would not die till he saw the Messiah. And again, we wished we had volumes of details about all of these people. We wish we knew, well, how many other people did Simeon tell? It's kind of hard for me to believe that Simeon would have told nobody. Surely many other people must have known, well, crazy old Simeon says he's not going to die until he sees the Messiah, and he's getting quite old. We don't know how people reacted to that, but there is the baby with Mary and Joseph in the temple, and Simeon is directed to go into the temple on that particular day, and he takes the child. It must have been shocking to these two young parents, and he prays over the child, signifying this is the Messiah. And we have to wonder, well, why didn't anybody else hear this? Why wasn't anybody else kind of keeping their eye on Simeon. He says he's going to be identifying the Messiah. And then the very public announcement from the prophetess Anna, who had been living in the temple for decades. She sees the child and begins to proclaim that, yeah, this is the one, and explain the significance of this child. And our question has to be, how was all of this missed? I can understand, perhaps we can understand how, well, if this was just Mary's interaction with an angel, if this was kind of Elizabeth's prophecy in response to Mary, who else might have known this? But when you talk about Simeon and Anna in the temple, we have to wonder, well, why didn't anybody else see this? Was just the case of people dismissing an old man who kind of came up with an odd story? Was this just the case of Anna being a fixture in the temple because she had been there for decades and people just kind of ignored her? Now again, this morning we are going to come with a very public example of people identifying Jesus as something very different coming into our world. And so we could look at the Baptist Faith and Message, we could look at the London Declarations. Again, we are seeing that this is the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, being very and eternal God. This is the baby in the manger, the brightness of the Father's glory, of one substance and equal to the Father in all nature. And yet at the same time, he upholds and governs all things in the universe, that he was part of the creation. Not that he was created, but he was part of that act of creating the world. He took upon himself the fullness of God's nature and the fullness of man's nature, with all of the essential properties of man and God held together in a way that we still struggle to understand, and yet without sin. That is the essential understanding of who is this baby in the manger. And again, we would say, well, how could this be missed? The Baptist Faith and Message is a little bit more concise and not as wordy, but the Baptist Faith and Message basically says the same thing. This is the Son of God. This is God incarnate among us. This is Christ, the eternal Son of God, in his incarnation. That just means he took on a bodily form as Jesus the Messiah. He was conceived by the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. Jesus perfectly revealed and did the will of God, taking upon himself human nature with all of its demands and necessities. He got tired, he was hungry, he was thirsty, and identifying himself completely with us, as Hebrews that we had studied some months in the past says, he knows our nature. He knows what it's like to be one of us because he was one of us, and yet without sin. He honored the divine law by his personal obedience, even obedience to death on the cross. Well, looking at our verses this morning, we have three important questions we're going to look at. Who are these visitors? Why are they looking for a king? And well, what did they find? What does this tell us? Well, looking at these verses, we want to first identify who were these Magi. And I'm going to tell you right now, there weren't three of them. They weren't wearing robes. They probably weren't riding through the desert with robes. They weren't wearing crowns when they were riding through the desert. And yet, if we go back to that introductory slide with a picture of the Magi going through the desert, this seems to be what's on Christmas cards. If you've seen these type of Christmas cards, likely this is all that's depicted. Three kind of funny-looking guys in long flowing robes, wearing crowns, in the middle of the desert, pointing to a star. Well, we're going to see this morning that that's nowhere near the truth. There weren't three of them. They weren't wearing crowns. They didn't have flowing robes. More than likely, they weren't wearing camels. They didn't go to the manger. I know that's part of Christmas cards, and that's usually what in our nativity sets, but they weren't there then. They came much later. So I wanted to deal with this after Christmas because the wise men came after Christmas, as we would think about it. Well, who are these visitors? These visitors are actually a family, a clan, a tribe, so to speak, of royal priests. They came from a huge empire to the east. Now, at this time, you had the Roman Empire in the west covering much of the Mediterranean area and going up into what we call Britain, England area, into the east as far as what we would call Germany today. And then you have the Near East with Israel and Judea. Rome controlled much of North Africa. But east of Judea, you had this kingdom. These Parthians controlled that entire area from what we would call the area of Israel all the way to India and China. It was a huge kingdom. So it would make sense. You have a huge kingdom in the east, you have the Roman Empire in the west. These two kingdoms are going to come together and work out who's in charge. But these people who came to see Jesus were a special class of people. Now, John MacArthur makes a big deal about these people kind of belong to the same class as Daniel. In the book of Daniel, this is the same word that's used to describe what Daniel was. He was chief of the Magi. And John MacArthur would say that Daniel must have taught these people about the one true God. He must have taught them about the prophecies. There are some interesting kind of commonalities between the Magi and what we know the Bible says. The Magi practiced sacrifices, much like there are sacrifices in the Levitic law. The Magi were a family kind of tribe. You inherited the position, just like the priest in the Old Testament. The Magi didn't touch dead things, much like in the law of the Levites, in the Levitical law, with the laws of Moses, you don't touch dead things. They practiced sacrifices. They worshiped the one true God. In some aspects of the Magi, they're looking for the one great king. That all might be true. I'm not too sure how much to connect that with Daniel, but let's take a look at the actual history as we know it. They were, as I said, part of a ruling class of priests. They were not kings, but in some ways they validated who the king was. If you were going to be king of these people, you had to be validated by the Magi. And you had to be kind of instructed by the Magi to be part of the way that they worshiped. They didn't wear robes. I find this interesting. They wore tunics with pants that had oftentimes geometric patterns on them. And in the depictions we have, they have big mustaches, which I find fascinating, and close-cropped beards, if beards at all. So I like that aspect of them. They're depicted as having big mustaches. Yeah, they did have pointy hats. And they were very warlike. Now, the interesting part of this is they were entirely different than the way the Romans fought. These people, of course, loved their horses and incorporated horses into the way they fought battles. They were noted as having archers on horses that could shoot even backwards with deadly accuracy. Well, that's not the way the Romans fought. And they are going to start a series of battles for who can control the entire known world. Rome probably wanted to control the Middle East, and going even more eastward, they wanted the spice trades. So these are a series of wars that started roughly 60 BC for another 682 years. This was going to go back and forth. There were times of sort of coexistence, but this was going to go back and forth for over 600 years, nearly 700 years. At this particular time, when Jesus was born, there was a weak king, Pharautes IV. He appears in some records to have been invalidated by the Magi. And in fact, there was a rival king at about this same time. So the Magi are actually looking for another king to replace Pheretes IV. They were people known to have studied the stars. They were very versed in the way the patterns of the planets and the stars should work. And so if they did see something distinct in the east, they would have seen this as something important. So why are they looking for a king? Well, there is chaos in their homeland. Right about the time Jesus is born, there is this invalidated king. There is some internal strife going on. It's interesting that also, right about this time, Rome has gone through a huge change. Right about this time, Julius Caesar is assassinated. His adopted replacement, someone he actually adopted, Octavius, becomes Caesar Augustus. He has learned that dispersed power doesn't work out well, so he begins a rule of absolute control. He is the beginning of what we would call the one Caesar's controlling everything. And Rome begins to kind of go into a series of internal warfares and unsettling politics. It's about this time that we have Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and that whole political uncertainty. You have the uncertainty of Rome replacing someone who was sort of more agreeable to the Parthians, someone who came from the Greek Alexander the Great history side of things, with Antipater, someone who would be loyal to Rome through the support of this person against Mark Antony and some of the other Roman campaigns. He gets to assign his son to be the ruler of the area, Herod. These are not Jewish people. They are not from the tribe of Abraham. They're Idumeans. Herod would be a brutal, insecure, violent man. In fact, he would kill most of his own family. Caesar Augustus said it was better to be Herod's pig than his son. That's how brutal Herod was. Any threat, any uncertainty, he would just have the person killed. His own family, other political figures. So putting this all together, this is a time of uncertainties. This is a time of chaos. Not only in the area where these wise men came from, it's uncertainty going on with Rome. Now you have the people in Jerusalem saying, we're stuck with this guy Herod, and he's not even one of us. He's not even one of us. And yet we're stuck with this guy, and he's brutal and cruel, and he kills people just at the whim of uncertainties. So you have this group of people coming to see a king. And as we read this morning, they were following a star. I find it interesting that people want to explain the star in so many different ways. Some say it was the planet Jupiter. It was a combination of Jupiter and Saturn. It was a slow, low meteor, which makes no sense scientifically. They want to explain it in any other way rather than just accepting the fact that God put a light in the sky for these wise men to follow. You may as well accept the fact, because none of the others are going to make any sense. So they're following a sign that the Almighty have given them in the sky. And I would say just at this point, if John MacArthur was right, that these wise men were following the teaching of Daniel, and they had known the 70 weeks, and they'd worked that all out, why would they need a star? I'm not too sure. Maybe it is connected to Daniel, but there is a star in the sky that they're following. Now, as any politically astute people, they go to the wrong place. They follow the star to the west, and they go to Jerusalem. Well, if there's going to be a new king, surely he's in Jerusalem. Where else would a new king be? Only to find he's not there. And as we read the verses, they go to Jerusalem and they come to Herod and they want to know, where is this king that we know has been born because we've seen the signs in the sky. And when Herod heard this, he was greatly alarmed, and all of Jerusalem with him. Now, the reason why Jerusalem was greatly alarmed is they weren't coming by themselves. These would be three very important people. They were court dignitaries. They were coming with military escort. They were coming with cooks and servants. This was a large group of people coming into Jerusalem. If you could imagine, here's Herod warming himself in the winter, and an entire contingent, military escort, kingmakers come into Jerusalem, and they want to know, where's the new king? Problem: this isn't the king that the Romans are going to want to see. This is the very people that the Romans have been battling at least 3 times. In 64, in 55, in the 40s, there was just a sort of a tenuous peace at this point. With all of this chaos going on, is this a political play by these people from the east to again install their king in Jerusalem? Are they going to try to replace Herod because they know Herod is supported by Rome? Is this the beginning of an entire new war that's going to be centered right here in Jerusalem because of all the chaos going on? I find it fascinating. Herod calls the teachers and says, hey, they're looking for a king. Where is this king supposed to be? Because he's not here. I don't know of any king. And they know. They know exactly where they're supposed to look. This is from Micah chapter 5, verse 2. If there's going to be a king, you need to go to Bethlehem. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, you are in no way least among the rulers of Judah, for you are going to have a king who will shepherd my people Israel. Well, you need to go to Bethlehem, not here. It's interesting that Herod has no idea, but the idea he does have, if you think there's a king, I need to deal with that immediately to show my loyalty to Rome and to eliminate this so-called king. And so he says, yeah, you go to Bethlehem and let me know if you find him. Now, what's fascinating is Bethlehem is only 6 miles away. You would think these teachers, these priests, these experts that would come to Herod and say, well, if there is a king, it's in Bethlehem. Let's go see. It's hard for us to imagine this, but it's with such disinterest. It's with such dismissiveness. These experts are telling the wise men, the very kingmakers, these people who have said, we've seen an unmistakable sign in the sky, there's been a new king. And the experts are saying, yeah, you go look. If you find this king, come back and tell us, and we'll deal with him the way we want to deal with him, okay? Isn't that amazing? So they send them to Bethlehem. And again, this tiny little village. Here are all the horses. Here's the military escort coming to a little house and a little village. Everybody in the community knows this. And they're looking for Mary and Joseph and the baby. And when they find him, they are greatly, greatly ecstatic with joy, and they fall down and they worship this baby. That had to get throughout the entire community. They must have stayed there for a while because they are warned in a dream. Somehow they spent the night there, and as they nodded off to sleep, the angel told them, don't go back to Herod, you need to go a different way. Instead of going east to Jerusalem, maybe go up the King's Highway back to your homeland. Isn't that amazing? Everyone must have known this is the one house. This is the one people they came to see. Now, after they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Apparently, it was the same night. The angel comes to him. Maybe he had first gone to the Parthenians, to this group, and said, don't go back. But the angel to Joseph says, you need to get up now and leave to Egypt. Now, that's going to be about a 75-mile trip just to get to kind of the border between Herod's kingdom and Egypt, and another 100 miles to get to a community of Jewish people in Egypt. This wasn't sort of an, well, you know, there may be some political fallout. Let's just take a little trip to go down the road a little bit. This was a major undertaking. For Joseph to wake up in the middle of the night, I don't know how receptive Mary was, but for Joseph to wake up in the middle of the night and say, hey, I just had a dream. Pack up, we're leaving. Where are we going? We're going to Egypt. Now? Can't this wait? I've got to get some food together. I'm not done with the laundry quite yet. I don't know what the response might have been. Maybe Mary would have said, whatever the angel says, you know, I've talked to an angel once myself. If that's what the angel says, let's do it. In the middle of the night, saddling up with the new baby, taking off. And they were going to be traveling for weeks. Of course, you know the story. Herod is enraged. He sends his soldiers to the village, the small little village, and he kills all the babies. And again, some people would say, you know, that's rather extreme. Is that really believable? Well, from Herod, yes, it is. As I said previously, he was known for brutality. He was known for killing any possible rival. He was known for his paranoia. And again, as Caesar Augustus said, it's safer to be Herod's pig than one of his own sons. Could Herod have done this? Oh, yes. Now, this was a small village. We're not talking about hundreds of babies anyway. But there had to be a sense of, in the midst of the slaughter, someone must have been able to say, you know, I think one family got away. I think one baby wasn't killed. And as far as Herod was concerned, he had took care of the problem. Now notice some big lessons here this morning. Isn't it interesting that the response of those who knew the law, those who knew the prophecies, those who should be the most interested was, yeah, it's Bethlehem down the road. It's only 6 miles. You can walk there in an hour or so. Come back and tell us what you found. Of all people, in the middle of Roman expansion, in the middle of the uncertainty and the chaos of the Parthenians, in the middle of this cruel, phony pretender Herod, we might have expected the people to say, wait a minute, you say there's a king that's been born? That changes everything. Now we can get rid of Rome, we can get rid of Herod, he's going to be a mighty kingdom, we don't have to worry about these Parthenians and their... This is the start of something huge. Isn't that like today? Isn't that so much like today? You have people that hear the gospel today and they are in desperate need. They know their life isn't working. And you would think they would say, this is what I've been looking for. I need this. This will change everything. And like these priests and teachers, the priests and teachers who tell Herod, oh, it's just an hour's walk that way if there's, in fact, a king. Notice what they're saying. Yeah, Herod is a brutal pretender. Rome is just oppressive, and we're paying taxes we never thought we could afford, but we can deal with that. You go find this king. We'll deal with him, in the way that we need to deal with him. Isn't that amazing? Once again this morning, we are looking at the question, how was this missed? How was this missed? Last week, we saw people in the temple who should have heard Simeon, who should have heard Anna, and said, wait a minute, this is something different here. This is the king. We've been waiting for this king for so long. This morning, we're hearing the very teachers are telling Herod, yes, there are prophecies about a mighty king that's going to be born in Bethlehem, and if that's what they're saying they're here to find, that's where he is. You would think they would say, well, let's go see. If this is true, this changes everything. But they say, yeah, you go check it out. You come back and tell us what you find, and if it's true, we'll deal with him the way we need to deal with him. And of course, the way Herod dealt with him is, let me wipe this out. Which is exactly the way many people respond to Jesus. We have no problem with the baby in the manger. Yeah, that's no threat. We have no problem with a 12-year-old discussing things with the priest in the temple. Wait a minute, a mighty king who rules over the entire earth, a mighty king who now reigns at the right hand of the Father? I need to eliminate that. There are people today that are doing no different than Herod. Let me eliminate that, and I won't have to deal with it anymore. Herod kills the threat. Many people today just eliminate the threat in their own lives. In a world of competing kings, in a world where there was no established, undoubted, undisputed ruler over all of the earth, that's when Jesus came, the one true king. Oh, there were other competing kings, but the very teachers and priests should have said, well, we have a king, Herod, but he's not even one of us. He's a phony. He's only here because of Rome. Oh, there's other kings in the Parthian Empire, but they can't keep themselves straight. They've got rebellion going on, and they even have a rival king. Rome has had many civil unrest and civil wars going on, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra and Brutus, and yes, we do want a one true king. Let's go see this king in Bethlehem. It's interesting that Matthew puts this before us in such an undeniable, indisputable way. This is Jesus, the Messiah, who is the one true king. There are other competing kings, that's true, but he is greater than all of them. He reigns now at the right hand of the Father, and he will have absolute dominion. And our choice today is no different than Herod. We hear the truth today, and we can say, I need to go see this king. If he truly is king, I need to follow this king. Or we can be like Herod and say, if this is a king, I'm not so sure I want this king. I want to pursue my own pleasures. I will try to wipe out this king from my life. Isn't it odd that the very people who should have known who Jesus was, the very people who should have been joyous at the announcement that he had been born, the very people who could have easily gone and seen him, dismissed him. You go check it out. Come back and tell us what you find. Again, the very people who you would think have no business recognizing Jesus, they're the ones who recognize who he is. They're the ones who recognize who he is. They're the ones who fall down and worship him. They're the ones who offer him extravagant gifts. Not the ones you would expect. He wasn't welcomed into the palace by Herod. In fact, he ends up having to run to Egypt. Isn't it uncomfortable how much this matches with our own personal life? How it plays out with each one of us personally? How often we are kind of confronted with, there is a king. Are you going to recognize him as king, or are you going to try to make this Herod, Roman, Parthenian kind of phony thing work out? Even though there is one true king that you know is true. Are you going to try to make the best of your circumstances, or do you recognize the real king? Do you come to him this year and bow down and worship him and give him the best that you have? Or do you just look at others and say, you go check it out. Tell us what you find. Maybe we'll consider it then. This year, this new year, maybe as a personal pledge, maybe as a personal goal, maybe as a goal of this church, we can have this idea. This year we want to recognize the real king. This year we want to recognize the real king in our life. This year we want to recognize and be obedient to the real king in this church. We don't want to be dismissive. We don't want to be telling anybody else, you go check it out. You seem to be kind of extreme and emotional. Let us know what you think. How are you going to react this morning? Are you going to go to the real king, or will you try to make something else work? Now that's the real Christmas message. That baby in the manger, he's the real king. That baby in the manger, he's ignored by many. It's kind of interesting who does recognize him as the king. And that baby in the manger, are you going to recognize as the real king this morning? And in your life? And in this church? So that for this coming year, your question is, well, I need to be obedient to the king that I know now reigns forevermore. Now that's a big question. How are we going to answer that in the year ahead? Let us pray. Our Father, even as kingmakers from the East came and recognized who Jesus was and is, we want to recognize who Jesus is this morning in our life and in this church. We want to be obedient to his reign and rule, and we want to present to him in recognition of his authority and position and power the best that we have. Let this be a momentous, important event in our life where we do recognize the one true King. To your honor and glory in our lives and in this church we pray. In the name of our risen Lord, amen.